the fire rises.
Welcome to the Battle of the Fords! Now I know I'm certainly not the first one to tackle this Flamewar topic, but most of the videos that I've seen have either been based off a popularity vote, which can tend to be skewed, or they've just been a really superficial discussion. And if there's one thing us nerds like to do, it's argue about pointless details. Let me clarify right off the bat, Indiana Jones 4 does not count. It doesn't count in this debate. We don't need to explain the reasons why, we all know why. So, I've divided this Flamewar up into 5 categories: fear, combat, intelligence, pimp factor, and body count. When screening both Han and Indy by these categories, the victor should be made clear. Let's begin. Fear. Who's more fearless, Han Solo or Indiana Jones? Well, immediately Indy's fear of snakes comes to mind. So he's already kind of starting off on the wrong foot. But in his favour, Indy is not intimidated by even the most menacing opponents, from freaky warlock worshippers of death to the Nazis and even Adolf Hitler himself. And while this is impressive, we can say the same thing about Han, who we saw going up against the equivalent of space Nazis in the Empire, with Sith powers just as scary as anything that this weird Temple of Doom cult did. When Han confronted Vader, he doesn't get scared, he just starts blasting away. Even after he gets tortured, he just shrugs it off like it was nothing.
I feel terrible.
Han shrugs off flying into an asteroid field.
You're not actually going into an asteroid field.
It'd be crazy to follow us, wouldn't they?
He even shrugs off being blind.
I think my eyes are getting better. It's sort of a big dark blur. I see a big light there.
Indy also shrugs off being completely outnumbered and having a multitude of injuries. So while they might seem kinda even in this regard, we just can't go past the fact that Indy has a crippling phobia and Han doesn't. We gotta give this point to Han Solo.
Sir, the temperature's dropping too rapidly.
That's right, my friend's out in it.
Until the ponton will freeze before we reach the first marker.
Then I'll see you in hell.
Combat. Fearlessness doesn't mean much though if you can't fight to save yourself. So who's better in combat? And we're going to divide this category into armed combat and unarmed combat. Let's start with armed combat. Both guys are pretty good shots. Han, however, is also a really awesome tactician in space battles, outsmarting and outnumbering the Empire on numerous occasions. Indy can also fly, but clearly it's not his greatest strength.
I didn't know you could fly a plane. Why, yes. Land? No.
But Indy more than makes up for it with his combat skills, not just with guns, but with knives, with random objects, and let's not forget his trademark whip. Indy can even use his surrounding environment as a weapon. Apart from Han's abilities with the blaster and his groovy Millennium Falcon moves, he's basically useless in any other kind of armed combat. He does throw a box at a guy at one point, but really, unless you're going to count Chewbacca as a weapon of his, then Indy has to take the point in armed combat. But what about unarmed combat? This one's easy. Han Solo doesn't throw a single punch in the entire trilogy. He does do some kind of judo moves on a stormtrooper in Return of the Jedi, who, by the way, is clearly waiting off-screen for Harrison Ford to finish his line before he attacks him. That's nice of him. But since these same stormtroopers get thrashed by Ewoks later in the film, Solo beating this guy up doesn't really mean very much. Indiana Jones is a one-man wrecking crew of destruction. He takes on literally an entire truckload of bad guys with nothing but his own bare hands. And I'm pretty sure that Indy was the one who introduced the double punch into movies. So cool. Once Han loses his gun, it's all over.
We would be honored if you would join us.
But let's take a look at what Indiana Jones does in a similar situation where he loses his gun. Indy effortlessly takes the point on Unarmed Combat. Intelligence. Muscle power is good, but brain power is just as important, if not more so. And like with combat, we're going to divide this up into two sections: street smarts and book smarts. Book smarts is pretty easy to determine. Han Solo is a career criminal, while Indiana Jones is a professor and an all-around well-educated guy. Han is a pilot that can navigate interstellar travel, but that's not such an impressive feat considering that even a simple farm boy like Luke Skywalker could pilot through space.
I understand you've become quite a good pilot yourself.
So Indy once again wins this one. Street smarts, however, is a whole different story. This is much more Han Solo's thing. He runs more on gut instinct than on reading books. And it pays off because his gut instinct, especially about people, is almost always right. And yes, he was betrayed by Lando. But he only trusted him because he had no other choice, and his instinct about him eventually did prove true because Lando is a good and trustworthy guy. But Indiana Jones got scammed over and over and over again. For a smart guy, he was pretty dumb when it came to who to trust. In fact, the very first thing that happens in Raiders of the Lost Ark is he gets double-crossed by this Arab guy.
No time to argue. Throw me the idol. I throw you the whip. Give me the whip. Adios, señor.
He gets tricked by the Indian diplomat in Temple of Doom. He gets tricked by his old boss in Last Crusade, as well as the blonde chick. Han Solo would have been able to sniff out all of these traitors before they could do anything. Indy even stupidly drinks a poison drink. Han Solo decidedly takes the point for street smarts. Pimp factor. Now before you say that this doesn't even matter when it comes to who's better as a hero, let me just say, being a ladies' man is an indispensable part of the whole action hero package. James Bond hasn't had 23 movies because he sucks at getting a girl, if you know what I mean. So it's definitely something that we have to factor in when we're comparing the two. Han Solo eventually does get the girl.
I love you.
I know.
But since his only competition in that department dropped out of the running because he turned out to be the girl's brother, we can't really call him a pimp, even though he would call himself that. But Indy is the true pimp daddy. He has a new girl for each movie and an entourage of groupies at his college where he works, even including some male ones. Yes, Indiana Jones no longer has crabs because all the crabs died of syphilis. That's how much this guy gets around. Awkward. Point Indy.
I'm going to continue to do things the way I think they should be done.
How dare you kiss me?
Body count. Anybody can cut down hordes of anonymous henchmen. They're basically just cannon fodder in these kind of movies. But Batman is so awesome because he defeats awesome villains. Who cares about him beating up some random street thugs? It's when he defeats the main villain that earns him his status. So for this reason, we're not going to do a body count of just overall kills, because that's not really a measure of a hero. It's about dispatching the main bad guy and the secondary bad guys. So our body count will be made up of that, not the henchmen. Now this might seem unfair, because Indy was the main character who had a new bad guy in each movie, while Han was a supporting character with the same bad guys for all three movies. But it's actually not, because the format of an Indy movie often has the main bad guy being killed by supernatural means connected with whatever the artifact was that he's after, rather than Indy doing the job himself. So it's more even than you might think. So let's walk through who the villains were and how they died. In Star Wars, obviously we have Darth Vader and the Emperor, neither of which were killed by Han. We also have Grand Moff Tarkin, who was killed when the Death Star exploded in the first movie, which Han helped to facilitate, but Luke was the one who actually fired the shot to take it down, not Han. There was also Jabba the Hutt, who although he was directly an enemy of Han Solo, he was killed by Princess Leia. However, Han does take down one of the most popular villains in the whole Star Wars trilogy, Boba Fett. Even though he didn't really mean to kill him, he still gets the kill, cause he did it by himself and while he was blind. And don't try to tell me that Boba Fett didn't really die because his Mandalorian suit of armor protected him from the guttural acids of the Sarlacc. We're focusing on the movies here, not any of the books or the comics that came afterwards. So Han's body count is just 1. What about Indy? Well, his opponents were the 2 Nazis and Belog, who were all killed by the Ark of the Covenant's angel things. And the big Nazi guy by the plane who was actually killed by Marion Ravenwood with the propeller blades. But Temple of Doom is where the blood really starts to flow. He breaks the Indian diplomat's ribcage in this wheel thing, he crushes the giant bearded guy in the rock crusher, and drops the high priest into a crocodile-infested river. Then, in the last crusade, Indy's old boss kills himself by choosing the wrong grail, and the blonde chick dies by falling into the bottomless pit. But her death doesn't count as a body count for Indy because he was actually trying to save her. And finally, Indy bashes General Vogel's face in and drops him off a cliff. So this makes Indy's final body count up to 4 bosses. So up against Han's accidental 1, Indy again takes the category. Verdict. So you see, it's becoming pretty clear who the overall winner is. While Han gets the points for fearlessness and street smart, Indy gets the points for armed combat, unarmed combat, book smarts, pimp factor, and body count. Wow. And even if we decide to rule out book smarts and pimp factor, as they may not be of any use in an actual physical fight between the 2 guys, Indy still wins it 3-2. And if that isn't enough for any Han Solo fans out here, here's a bonus point for you. Han achieves his victories with the support of Chewie, Luke, Leia, Lando, and the entire Rebel Alliance. Whereas the closest thing Indy ever came to having backup was this Chinese kid. Mostly the people who were supposed to help him ended up being a hindrance.
Dad! Are we hit? More or less. Son, I'm sorry. They got us.
Indy basically had to do all of it by himself, and he still had better success at defeating his enemies than Han Solo did. If Indiana Jones was in one of the Star Wars movies, he would have snuck onto the Death Star in Return of the Jedi, beaten up one of the Emperor's Imperial Guards, disguised himself as one of them, and then waited until Vader and the Emperor walked past him, and just blasted them in the back of the head before they even knew what was going on. Or he'd have like an old Jedi artifact that could call up ghosts of like Yoda or Mace Windu, and that they could take them down. However, if Han Solo was in any of the Indiana Jones movies, he'd get killed within the first 10 minutes, either by some kind of booby trap or by being overrun by hostile natives. And as far as a one-on-one fight between the 2 of them goes, this is how it would go down. Han goes for his blaster, Indy cracks that whip, snaps the gun right out of his hands, and it's all over for Han, because he's not going to win in a fist fight against Indy. Yes, my friends, no matter which way you slice it, Indiana Jones wins.